I want to talk a bit about a method that I currently use in all my projects that helps making my code reusable and also my projects easily portable. Both of these terms are quite important, and I think they link quite tightly together. And as they apply to everyday development, I think of them quite a lot, and I try and make it as streamlined as possible. For this, I use a feature in source code control called Submodules, which was mentioned a couple of times in the presentation before. Quick little bit about me. I'm a software architect and a pragmatic programmer, generally. I mainly use LabVIEW, but I also enjoy other languages. I'm a certified Scrum Master that has experience looking after small multilingual teams. Outside of work, I'm a Braai Master and a part-time brewer. If you want to talk about any of those, come find me afterwards and I'll have a chat. So let's get started. A few months ago, I put out a survey to the community to try and get a few ideas on how people use source code control and what tools they use for reuse. Part of the survey was to get me kick-started in generating this presentation, but it did give me quite a few insights. I want to thank everyone who completed the survey, and they were quite a decent response. Of the 41 responses I received, more than half are architects, with the next biggest portion being lone developers. 5% are in management roles, and I'm maybe glad to say, there is only one non-source code control user in the responses.
Yes.
One still too many. I'm hoping that one came from the management-only role, but I'm not too sure.
They're probably not going to.
So what is source code control? Most people use it already, all but one, so I'll be brief. Source code control, in a general sense, is just some sort of version control system that tracks changes in documents or files. For software in particular, the primary purpose is to store a commented revision history throughout the product or the software development cycle. I must note that using source code control is one thing, but without committing often and using clear, concise commit notes, you sort of lose the benefit that you get. But any source code control use is better than nothing. So even if your commit notes are rubbish, just using it's a good step in the right direction. Of the three main players, when it comes to source code control, you get Git, Subversion, and Mercurial, and this can be seen by 93% of users using one of these three. I personally use Git, so I'll be using Git in all the examples going forward. And a bit of news off the press, as of last night, Atlassian announced that they are no longer supporting Mercurial from June 2020, and they are going to drop all their HD repositories. So I'd stay away from Mercurial if you use Bitbucket. So the title of my presentation, Git Submodules, an alternative approach to reuse. What is a submodule? In the purest sense, as far as the server is concerned, a submodule is a standard repository, nothing more. When that repository is cloned into another repository, it becomes a submodule. There is no way of putting a repository inside a repository without making it a submodule. The main repository will then see a reference pointer, which is the remote and a commit hash to the submodule, but on disk, the files are checked out. The files are on disk. This is shown on the left image. So on the left-hand side, you'll see I made a demo project where I had basic project with 4 submodules in it. All the main repository sees is a commit hash. That is it. This has the added benefit of keeping your main repository very small or smaller, because all the source code that sits in your submodules isn't actually in your main repository. There's just a hash. So you have multiple small repositories which make up one big project. I've worked on repositories where they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it can cause problems. The main repository manages the submodules by using a Git modules file, and this tells the main repository where the submodule sits, where its remote is, and where it sits on disk. And this can be seen on the picture on the right-hand side, which describes where the repositories are. So when a change is made inside your submodule, which is treated like a normal repository when you're actually in it. The updated submodule is seen by the main repository as just a hash change. So if you do a git diff on the change, all you'll see is an old hash and a new hash. You won't actually see any changes because the main repository doesn't know about the files inside it or the history inside it. Submodules can be recursive, infinitely so. However, as a rule, I do not use recursive submodules. This is mainly due to a way that LabVIEW manages files and names in memory. If you want to discuss more about that, come find me afterwards. So you might be wondering, Git and Mercurial are distributed source code control systems, which means you have a repository on the server and you have a local copy of the repository. For a single standalone repository, you get a hidden .git folder, which sits in the root of your repository, and that is your local copy. This contains your local history, your branches, your tags, everything locally before you push it up to the server. So where does your local repository sit for each submodule? Within this .git folder, there's a modules folder, and within that modules folder are the equivalent local repositories for each submodule. I'll touch a little bit more on this later on. So that's basically what a submodule is. It's a repository which you add to a main. It's a normal repository which you add to a parent owning repository, so you can track the changes separately. There's some common commands which I get through, or which I use. So submodules can be managed from GUI tools like SourceTree and TortoiseGit, and all the others that exist. I, however, prefer to use the command line. It gives me a better insight into what's going on and helps me understand, just helps me understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing things. So first of all, how do you add a submodule into your main repository? Instead of using the git clone command, as if you would clone out a single repository, you just use a git submodule add URI to the submodule and where you want it on disk. That's it. What that'll do is it'll clone the submodule into your repository, so it puts the files on disk. It will create the .git modules file if it doesn't already exist, and add its remote and where it sits on disk. And then it'll stage the changes for you as well. So the two changes that gets automatically staged would be your git modules files updated or added, and you have the hash. So the latest hash that's in your submodule would be staged. You then have the option to commit those changes or reset and roll them up in other commits. Personally, I will commit that as a single change because one thing has changed. The next, less common but still sometimes used, is removing a submodule. This comes in two stages. You first need to use the git rm command, which takes the submodule out of your main repository. So what this will do is it will remove the files from disk, and it will remove the entry in the git modules folder. That causes two changes, which get staged automatically, and then they can be committed. The second step of the process of removing a submodule is removing the local copy of the repository. This doesn't get done automatically, so you have to go into the .git modules wherever it is on disk and basically just delete that folder. One thing to note though, you will be deleting all your local history for that submodule, so make sure you push those changes to the server before you delete that folder. Once it's gone, it's gone. Cloning a project that has submodules in it. One difference, you just need to use the ---- recurse submodules option. I tend to put this on all my clones now, whether I have submodules in my project or not. If there aren't any submodules, nothing happens. If there are submodules, you get them. What this will do is it will clone your project, your main repository. It will then look at if there's a git modules file at the root, and it will go in. If there is a git modules file, it will go into that file, and it will update all the submodules that are listed in that file. What this does is it checks your submodules out to a hash. So you're not on a branch, you're not on a tag, you are on a hash. This has a few complications, and you shouldn't be developing on a hash. So if you want, I can discuss that later on in a bit more detail if you want to come find me. Two common commands that I use as well would be git submodule update, and this is what gets done when you clone with the ---- recurse submodules. It updates the submodule to the hash that the main repository knows about, and then git submodule for each. This will run any git command on all your submodules in your project. I use this command. If I clone a repository out, all my submodules will come out on commit hashes, and then once I've cloned, I use the git submodule for each git pull master or git checkout master, which will then check out all my submodules to the master branch, and then I'm free to develop as I want. Code reuse, and how is that managed? And this is something, as I've mentioned before, I think quite a bit about. I think reuse can tie quite tightly into how portable your code is. For me, they go hand in hand. If you move your code base to a new PC, how easy is it to get up and running? Or if a new developer joins with a fresh PC, how long does it take to get the environment set up? As Chris just mentioned in the previous presentation about CI, how many steps does your build server have to do in order to build your project? Does it need to install packages, or how many steps does it need to take to do your build? From the survey, going back to that again, 63% are developers working in teams. This is really good. However, this can introduce some stumbling blocks, especially when working on LabVIEW projects. When multiple developers work, how do they work on the same project without causing conflicts? And merging conflicts is not fun. Yes, there are tools, but it's not fun. I try and stay away from that as much as I can. So one use case I've come up with is, how long does it take for you to update a reuse library of code? This would generally be an internally controlled library, but how many steps does it take for you to do that? So I try to list them out, and for me, you first got to switch to your library project. So you're going away from your active development project. You go to your library project, you need to make your changes. You then need to build a distribution, whatever tool you use. You then need to install that distribution. Maybe restart LabVIEW, more than likely, because it needs to come back up in the new environment. Then you need to go back to your development project. That's at least 6 steps that takes you away from your active development project. And for me, that's context switching, it's distractions, it's getting your head out of where you're supposed to be. And that for me is a time killer, a productivity killer. One other question you can ask is, can different versions of the same library be used for multiple projects on the same environment on a single PC, forgetting VMs? I don't think it can, especially when you use libraries baked into the LabVIEW environment. However, with submodules, I found this is possible. As all the code is within a project repository, it can be easily picked up and moved. Makes my code really, really portable. A specific version can be installed into a repository. A specific version of the submodule I can use in each repository, which means I can use different versions of my library within my different projects on the same PC without conflicting each other. And lastly, if you want to update your library or your submodule, the files are in your project. All you need to do is update them, commit the changes in your submodule, push that submodule, commit that new hash into your main repository, and just carry on working. You don't have to leave your project, your development environment. Now, this is obviously subject to your internal release process of your libraries, of your reuse code. I personally don't release my reuse codes as standalone entities. When I release a build, I part of my build process, I get the hash for each submodule that's part of that project, so then I know what's being used. So some of the popular methods of reuse, VIPM was by far the winner, which is understandable. Copying locally is quite high, the rate's quite high. 24% of users just copy the reuse code locally, which I was quite surprised to see. However, it shows me that people want control over their code, over their libraries. And that whole 24%, with one small change, you can be using submodules. You can have a revision history on your reuse code, and you won't see much difference in your development environment, but you'll see a lot of benefits in your tracking and how your projects are structured. Using submodules allows me, the developer, full control over what is in my project. I can choose which version I want to use, and I can move them around as I see fit. For me, this covers all bases, and it's what I've chosen to use. Any code that I care about is in a submodule. I have very few VIs that I depend on that are in VILib, LVLib, any of the LabVIEW-based environment folders. So this brings me on to This brings me on to a project provider application that I've developed, which helps me maintain my submodules. Yes, this can all be done from the command line, it can be done from a user interface tool, but that takes me away from my LabVIEW environment. I want to do as much as I can in my LabVIEW environment. I'm not going to go into project providers. There are a few presentations out there. They all say do not use them, do not get into them, do not develop them. They crash LabVIEW easily. All of that is true. However, there is a fair amount of documentation out there on the community, and in my opinion, one of the better documented lower level APIs which form part of LabVIEW. So what does my tool do? I'm going to play a video, and then I'll basically talk through it. It will load, whenever I load a project, my project provider tool loads. It will allow me to add a submodule to a given folder. Generally, I put all my submodules in a folder called submodule. All my driver submodules go into a folder called drivers. It will add the submodule. I add a few, so it just basically loops around a couple of times. I add a submodule, or the tool adds a submodule for me. Those changes automatically get staged by the submodule add command, and then my tool will do the commit as well. So with a few clicks of the button, I can add a submodule, commit the change, and it's sitting on disk for me. It also uses an asynchronous system exec, which I've developed, which I think is quite cool. It's been something I've wanted to do for a while, and I've eventually got around to doing it. Again, if you want to find out about that, come find me and I can tell you about it. And then the libraries are on disk, ready for me to add to my project. Is that the end? Yeah. The next video is how do I, so now I've added a whole bunch of submodules I want to develop. I've worked on another project, I've updated a library, but I want to get it reflected into this project that I've now gone back to. How does that work? So I open the project. I've got 2 VIs in there. I can also load it from the tools menu. Those are the submodules in the project. I can fetch all updates. So it'll go through and fetch any changes upstream that have happened. I can then get a status update, and I can see that, yep, I've got one submodule that there are changes upstream, and I want to go get them. So then I can just hit pull, and then using Git Submodule for each Git pull will iterate through all the submodules and pull the latest change. I then get a message to say restart LabVIEW, because I'm not using auto-populating folders, so I need to restart the LabVIEW environment to update from what's changed on disk. and my new updated submodule is there. So that's my plugin, or sort of plugin. It's currently work in progress. I add features as I get annoyed with doing them manually and when I get spare time. But this is a bit of a list that I have on what I want it to do. I want to pull a single submodule rather than pulling them all. If only one's changed, I only should have to pull one. I shouldn't have to pull all 10 submodules just to pull one. I want to pull one only. I want to pull a specific hash or tag. I've mentioned I don't release my submodules or my reused libraries. If I did, I would have an annotated tag, which sits at my release point. I want to be able to pull that tag. I want to add the submodule to my project. I've got the project up. I know which library I've added. I just need to add it. That should be a simple step. Not sure why I've not done that yet. I want to be able to remove submodules. At the moment, I've got the button, but it doesn't do anything. I've got to go and do it manually. I don't often remove submodules, so it's not really become an issue for me yet. I want to make it work. I want to make my tool work similar to the Arduino library manager or how Gradle dependencies works in Android development. I've spoken to a few people earlier today and previously, and I think it'll be quite a good thing if we can get this working. And I don't think it's that difficult. I then want to support SVN and not anymore Mercurial. So how does an Arduino library manager work? I'm not sure how many people have used it, but a quick overview. Basically, a library is defined by a JSON file, indicated on the left-hand side on the bottom. In that JSON file is a path to a GitHub repository. It has a bit of information inside the JSON file as well. And then in the Arduino environment, you can see on the left-hand side each section, of which that top bit is one of them. It has your library, it has a bit of a description, and then the right-hand arrow is pointing to a drop-down which gets populated by all the annotated tag, all the releases that are in that GitHub repository. So all you need to do is select the version you want to install, hit install, and away you go. On the right-hand side is a snippet of a Gradle file that uses Maven repository, which basically knows about all the modules, all the packages that it can install. Then in your build dependency section, which is on the top, you basically list your package name, :version, and when you hit your build, pre-build, it'll run your dependencies, it'll get those dependencies for you, and it'll run your build process. Pretty straightforward, and I don't think it's that difficult to get done in LabVIEW. So I've been talking about Git in all my examples, but submodules are not only part of Git. They also exist in other source code control tools. The other two main tools, mainly Subversion and Mercurial, both have an equivalent to Git submodules, where SVN has, or Subversion has externals, and Mercurial has sub-repositories. I'm assuming Mercurial works a similar way how Git works, and I'm not sure how externals work when there's no local copy, everything's done on a server, but I'm pretty sure it's quite similar how it works. Lastly, a bit about my working practice. How do I fit submodules into my workflow? Generally, I only use the master branch for my submodules. As I've said, they are active, growing libraries. They never really stay stagnant for long periods of time. Most of them carry on. So I generally only use the master branch. I always clone a repository with the --recurse option, recurse submodules option. If my repository has submodules in it, I get them for free. If I don't even notice a difference. I use my project provider tool to help prompt the the checking of if I need to update anything. Because it pops up whenever I open a project, whether I want to check or not, it's just a trigger for me to remember to think, do I need to check or not? Because again, if I make a change and I push that change, if it's not the latest, I may have conflicts, which you want to try and avoid. All my submodule VRs are namespaced to an LV lib or an LV class. Very rarely do I use a project file in my submodule. They're generally a bag of VRs that do things rather than a project. I do have a few, but not many. Every submodule has a readme.md file. This sits at the top level of the repository of the submodule. So when I go onto Bitbucket, I can get a nice view of what dependencies my submodule has and why it's there. Helps for documentation. I have a post-build VI, which I run for every build, and that will go and get all the submodules that are part of that build. It'll get their hashes, and it'll write it all to a text file in my build output file. So I know this build was made with these submodules at this revision. And lastly, always separate source code from compiled code. That is the first thing I do. And it makes life using any source code tool so much easier. If you have any questions, want to come find me afterwards, that's my email, Twitter, come give me a shout. Got 3 minutes, go for it.
I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to ask one. One reason for releasing your reuse code, at least for us, is to separate the place where you modify it from the place where you like using it.
Yeah.
And I know there are technical ways to like make the repos read-only or anything, but is this something that bothers you?
No, I'm a single developer. I'm the only developer in the company. The one company I work for. I'm the only developer, so I know what's going on. My submodules are, most of them, or actually all of them, are, it's like static single-use VIs. None of them depend on each other. They are just tools that I use. So I've not really found the need to release them yet. But if I do, I will use annotated tags, and then I'll pull down an annotated tag or a version number similar to the way standard releases are done in GitHub or Bitbucket or one of those methods.
I actually had two questions. One, if you could go back to the previous slide.
Yo.
At the bottom where you get the hash of each submodule, do you do anything to make sure you don't have uncommitted changes?
Yes.
Okay.
So I do a git status check on all of them. I make sure nothing's uncommitted or staged but uncommitted, and then I get the hash. Yep.
Okay, great. And the other question, and maybe you covered this, say I've got a project, I'm working on it, and I create this library, and all of a sudden I'm like, hey, this looks really useful, I want to make it a reuse. Is there a way to take a directory that's already in your Git directory and turn it into a submodule?
Yes, I think there's a command called Git Submodule init, which is basically like Git init when you initialize a normal repository. I think you can use Git Submodule init in a folder, and then that will initialize that folder down as a submodule. I'm not sure.
Okay,
but
cool.
I think that'll work.
Fine, I won't take any more of your time.
I have a little question about your README-MD file.
Yes.
So you said that your submodules can have some dependency.
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. That's my bugbear with how this works on LabVIEW. And I've had quite a few discussions with a few people about it, and I've not quite found a way around it. So when I have a project, I know which submodules I want, and I check them all out, and I know until I've got all those submodules in that project, my project's going to be broken. So submodules depend on submodules. I just then need to have both submodules in my project. The problem with having submodules recursive in LabVIEW, you can't have the same library twice on disk. And if you put the submodule inside another library, it's library's namespace gets changed to have the owning library on top of it, which means you've changed your submodule, which means you need to commit the change, which could be different in other projects. So that's one thing I've not got my head around yet. So I'm okay with having to check them out individually. And that's why I put all the dependencies in the README file, so that I know when I use this submodule, I also need to add this one, and this one to make them work.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
I've used Submodule in the previous, right,
Where's it coming from? Oh, there we go.
a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
and a bit of a love-hate relationship with them. Everything you said, all the benefits are brilliant, and you've got around some of the hate with things like pulling in the hashes from all the sub-repos. That's one step I never quite got to. We came up with a different working method, which was, we still use the concept of submodules with isolated code in little repos, but we tend to pull them into the project and then detach them all.
Yep,
And then
that's possible.
It's a sort of halfway between copy and paste solution, halfway
Yeah.
between submodules, and we've found it's got around a lot of the problems that you've solved with other means that we never actually got around to doing.
The one thing I see how that can work. The one thing I don't necessarily like about that is if you want to update that library and you want that to propagate over all your projects, you've lost your history. You've lost your method of basically pushing a change up to your server and pulling it down somewhere else because you're now detached. You're not on that repository anymore. But yeah, that's definitely a way you could do it. I'm okay with the downside because I get benefits from it, which I prefer.
Just wanted to ask, it's kind of same fashion, but did you ever try out the GitLab sort of submodules, or you can make groups in GitLab?
No, I don't use GitLab, so I've not
Okay.
tried that out.
Because in GitLab you can just have a sort of hierarchical grouping,
Okay,
and then you get the submodules and the monolithic style repositories for free.
okay. No, I've not tried that before, so I'll have a look at that.
One thing I'll mention is if you use GitLab and you're trying to do CI and you have submodules, you have to change them to relative paths. So, yeah, I ran into that problem. So if you run into that, that's the issue.
I know you said that you only use the master branch, but do you have any experience with working with different branches and the submodules for some of the branches working on different layers, if you know what I mean? So if you had a development branch A and the submodule needed to be on C for its development branch, and when you change the development branch on the parent to B, the submodule needed to be on a different one. Is that possible, do you know?
So, yeah, your submodule, when you navigate into the folder into the submodule, you're in its own repository. So they can have different branches. They aren't the same. So your branches are disconnected between your main repository and your submodules. However, if you're on a branch in your submodule and you commit that submodule point in time in your main repository, it's committed as a hash. So if you check out to that hash, you'll be on the hash, but you can find where that hash is and you can get onto that branch. So if we wanted to do no work in that submodule, if you just wanted to use it, you could just use Git Submodule update, and it will update that submodule to the latest version that your main repository knows. It doesn't really care what branch it's on because it's a commit hash and they are unique.
I'm not a Git ninja, but I think there's a problem if you're on your branch and you have a submodule checked out and it's a different revision, and then you check out a different branch. I don't think it automatically updates your submodules.
No, you have to
So
run.
you have to manually
You have
do
to
something.
run Git Submodule update, which will then
Okay.
check out each submodule to their committed hash.
Yeah.
And that gives you a detached head and all other problems.
Yeah, but it's worth being aware
Yeah.
of that.
In the Gradle plugin that I showed you, in the Gradle dependencies, what they do is you can have a pre-built hook which will do a Git Submodule update, so it'll update all your submodules to the version that you need. LabVIEW can't do that because in your pre-build you can't update your files and code without restarting the project and all those sorts of things.
Also, you could have submodules in one branch and not in the other ones. So there's
Yes, you
It could
could.
very
Yeah,
well
you could, definitely. So we are out of time, so I'm not sure how we do cut.
One question.
One question.
Let's say my coworker changes a repository. Is there a way for him to know that I used this as a submodule to prevent problems or something like that?
You need to look into the repository. You need to look and see how the repository is laid out. But yeah, you can. If the submodule's changed, he would have to run an update, and he would need to know.
Sorry, I mean he renames it or he replaces it to another location and he removes the old.
That'll break things.
Okay.
That'll break.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.